Okay, well, it is 11:31, and we're going to try to do our best to be respectful of everyone's time this morning. So I'll go ahead and kick us off. Going to open up with a few announcements on behalf of the Memphis World Trade Club. But, we're just incredibly delighted to have Peter Friedmann with us today, who's the founder of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition. And I know it's going to be a great talk here with Peter. And I just want to highlight the fact that we are basically snowed in here in Memphis with 10 to 11 inches of snow. And I'm really thankful that we have the technology that we have that allows us to be able to do this. I think sometimes it's important to look at the silver lining because, hey, if we had done this in person, we'd probably be calling it off this morning. So I think we're kind of lucky in that regard. But my name is Daniel Booth, and I'm the president of the Memphis World Trade Club for 2021. And I just want to welcome you all and thank you for taking time out of your day to join this February virtual luncheon. And again, we're really excited to have Peter Friedmann on with us, who's an amazing resource. And I personally can't wait to hear what he has to say today. A few announcements to kick us off. First of all, I want to congratulate our Super Bowl Squares winners that we had early in February, which was Rick Record. Rick, I hope I didn't butcher your name if you're out there. And then myself. And by the way, that was not rigged, even though I'm the president. That was not rigged. I actually purchased that square on behalf of someone else. And also Amanda Coates, who won our third and fourth quarters for the Super Bowl Squares. And I can't think of anyone more deserving to win 2 quarters there. So congrats, Amanda. We had a lot of fun with the Super Bowl Squares event, and with your help, we were able to raise $500 for our Nail Ball Scholarship that will go towards go to high school students of the Memphis East High School Transportation Academy. And so we had a lot of fun. We raised $500 extra for the scholarship fund. And we had so much fun with it. We'll probably do it again in the future. So be on the lookout for that. I want to share my screen with you just real quickly, and hopefully I'll do this correctly this time. The Memphis World Trade Club has launched our YouTube channel, and I want to encourage all of you to go to YouTube and search Memphis World Trade Club in the search bar. It'll pop up with our logo. As you can see, we only have 8 subscribers right now because it's brand new. But we're going to be uploading webinars just like this and other video content to our YouTube channel. So I'd like to invite you to go to YouTube, go to Memphis World Trade Club, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I think that's going to be a great resource for us and our membership over the coming years. And then finally, if you're not a member of the Memphis World Trade Club, I just want to take a moment to encourage you to join the Memphis World Trade Club, especially if you're in the global supply chain and logistics industry. It's a really great organization. It's a great philanthropy. It's a great networking organization. And also, very importantly, it's a great educational organization and kind of throughput for education for our membership. And so to join, you would just go to memphisworldtradeclub.com and click on join. And then where it says become a member, I'm going to cancel this and log out, or attempt to, just so you can see it. Got to move these little squares here. Let's see. Sign up for a new account. So under become a member, you enter your basic details, how you want to pay, what type of membership you want, and then just click join now. And it's really that simple. And then you'll be a member of the Memphis World Trade Club. And, with COVID, we haven't been able to take advantage of some of our normal fundraising opportunities. And, I just want to remind everyone that this organization was established in 1947 for the promotion of international trade in Memphis. And so if you have any stake at all in this industry, really encourage you to join, because membership is the lifeblood of this organization, and we want to keep it strong for the future. And then finally, I just want to point out that if you want to renew, just log into your account, and under the membership profile, there will be a renew button that you can easily renew your membership, and just let us know if you have any issues at all in doing so. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Peter Friedmann. Peter is a Washington, D.C. insider. As he mentioned, he's based there most of the year. He's frequently quoted as an authority on trade, transportation, and the Washington, D.C. scene. And Peter's really happy to be with us today at the Memphis World Trade Club. As counsel in the United States Senate, Peter drafted significant international transportation and revenue laws, such as the Ocean Shipping Act, which guide and regulate our international commerce. And upon leaving Capitol Hill, he's represented universally recognized consumer brand name companies manufacturing globally, as well as port authorities, tech companies, and transit agencies. So at this time, Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we're looking forward to your talk today.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's very nice to be invited back to Memphis and back to the Memphis World Trade Club. What a great organization. I didn't know that it's been around since 1947, but I knew it's been around a long time. And I have to tell you, there are many cities in this country that are much larger than Memphis that have attempted to maintain a World Trade Organization, a World Trade Association or club, and have not been able to do so. You'd be surprised. There are a few cities that have exemplary clubs, and I would put Memphis in one of those. I mean, to be around from continuously for 60, 70 years is really terrific to have that continuity, because it's really important. And again, congratulations, because they're larger cities who would love to have a Memphis World Trade Club in their town with the continuity and activity. And I know a lot of the people that are very active internationally on international trade that are in Memphis, in the area. So it's great to be with you. It seems to me that I was in Memphis the last time you had your major snowstorm. So maybe you ought to think about that before inviting me once we get off of Zoom, but great to be with you. You know, at one point, somebody pointed out that Memphis is the largest port of entry in the United States in terms of customs entries. And if it isn't the top, it's always right in the top 4 or 5 in the country, which is a big surprise to people who live in, you know, Los Angeles or Seattle or New York, New Jersey, or even Savannah and so forth, that Memphis actually surpasses many cities, many major ocean seaport cities in terms of entries, because of course, what do you have? About a third of US cargo entering the United States does pass through Memphis. So maybe highly appropriate that Memphis World Trade Club is so successful. I'd like to talk a little bit today on trade and transportation issues, but let me say at the outset, I love being interrupted. So if I'm not covering something, or if I'm saying something you don't understand, or you disagree with, I love it when you interrupt me. So let's go ahead and do that. And hopefully Daniel will see some comments come in that he can interrupt me. But at the outset, let me start out and talk about the number one issue in DC is not the whole impeachment thing. I mean, let me just say at the outset, do not watch the cable news networks. I don't care what your politics are. I don't care whether it's CNBC or MSNBC or Fox. It's not news. It's just opinion. It's just, well, I call it garbage. And I highly recommend that people not watch those channels. At least don't believe anything you see on them. It might be entertaining. So the number one issue in Washington, D.C. for the last few weeks has not been the impeachment. It has not been the number one issue even on Capitol Hill. The number one issue on Capitol Hill is the daily work that they're trying to do. even during the impeachment trial and the impeachment debate over in the House of Representatives, there was one thing that we in Washington all knew. Members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, wanted to get the impeachment business out of the way. Whether they were for convicting or acquitting, they just wanted it done. And that's something that we see frequently, that behind the scenes, behind the cable news networks, the Republican and Democratic congressmen and senators are in agreement with many more things than they're given credit for. Even on impeachment, they agreed on one thing. They wanted to get it out of the way. Republicans obviously wanted it out of the way because it was painful for the party. The Democrats wanted it out of the way because here comes Joe Biden with a new president, with a new agenda, and a new majority in the Senate, and they wanted to move forward with their agenda. And they were eager to move it. And that's why the trial was shorter than legally allowed. It could have gone on for 2 more days, but they cut it off voluntarily. Republicans, Democrats agreed to cut it short. And so we're past that now, but we were essentially past it for those of us who work in Washington, who are on the phone, on the Zoom, on the emails every day, every hour with members of Congress and their staff. We were already long past impeachment. We're on the other issues. So now they're going to be focusing on the number one priority, which is the number one, is COVID. The number one is COVID, and the number one is COVID because their debate is over how much money to spend on a COVID bill and what else to put in the COVID bill. Because you'd be surprised when you get a big bill like this one's going to be, trillions of dollars. It becomes what we call a Christmas tree, and it gets loaded with all sorts of things. So one of the major provisions of this COVID relief bill is the debate now over whether to increase across the country the minimum wage to $15, which is an interesting debate altogether. I guess they propose $15 for both New York City and $15 for a place in Oklahoma, where wages are lower. So there's a big debate over that. In fact, the biggest debate on the COVID relief bill are going to be things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as COVID relief. But it's all about the dollars and how much money they're going to spend. But what are we going to talk about here today? We're going to talk about trade and transportation. So again, cable news wants to say how everything's different between Republicans and Democrats, between Biden and Trump. Well, one area which is not going to be very different between Biden and Trump is going to be trade, and specifically the tariffs on imports from China. Do not expect the status quo to change anytime soon. In fact, the tariffs on imports from China were very popular on Capitol Hill for the last 2.5 years since they were imposed. In fact, over the last 2.5 years, not one Republican, not one Democrat introduced an amendment, a bill, or ever proposed that those China tariffs, the tariffs that we imposed on imports from China, be rescinded. Not one Republican, not one Democrat in House and Senate ever proposed that we should eliminate those. So you can see they're widely popular. The AFL-CIO, the US Labor Union Organization president, wrote a letter in January to President Trump, and labor is going to have a lot of influence with this administration, saying they wanted to keep the tariffs that we currently have on China in place. In addition, they proposed new tariffs on imports from Vietnam. Not surprising, that's traditionally the labor union position. But again, it's another bit of emphasis that there is going to be a status quo when it comes to the China tariffs. So just count on them being there. There may be some exclusions allowed or not allowed. We don't know. US Trade Representative is going to be, unlike the previous one, very cautious, very deliberate, very deferential to the White House, very deferential to process. So there's not going to be any surprises when it comes to tariffs and other trade measures against trading partners. So if you're importing, handling imports from China, if you're engaged in e-commerce, any of those things, you can there'll be a status quo. I'm not sure we're going to add new tariffs on Vietnam for currency manipulation. I think we'll probably leave the status quo. Again, from Trump to Biden, not much change when it comes to trade policy. That's on tariffs. However, with the Biden administration and the new Democratic majority in the Senate, there will be another layer on top of the tariffs. It started with President Trump when he introduced measures to restrict the import of products from China that contained cotton origined in the eastern provinces of China, the Muslim minority there, a lot of human rights concerns, human rights abuses, and thus we have had in this country for a year now restrictions on imports of textile from China, from that region, and it's the biggest cotton growing and processing region in China. And we get so much apparel from China that you can imagine the restrictions impact and restrict the import of a lot of apparel from China. But even further, if the cotton is used in any product manufactured or assembled anywhere in the world, that product cannot enter the United States. This is requiring a lot of compliance activity for customs brokers and importers. And that is going to continue. And in fact, the enforcement efforts are going to be ramped up. It's not going to be a change in the policy, it's going to be a change in the enforcement. There'll be more enforcement of that China cotton import restriction. In addition, we're going to expect additional layers on top of tariffs designed to protect human rights, democracy, endangered species of plants and animals, slave labor concerns, child labor, so forth. Many of those laws are currently on the books and have been on the books for many years, but there's going to be enhanced enforcement. One evidence of that is the announcement a week and a half ago that we are restricting imports from Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, from entities that might be owned or controlled by about 10 generals who have now fomented a coup and replaced the democratically elected leader, and now they are running Burma. So on the Office of Foreign Asset Control list of people and entities you cannot do business with, there will be significant penalties to US companies importing from and sourcing from companies that are controlled by those generals. They start with import of gems, rubies, and so forth, but that extends quickly into apparel and footwear and even consumer electronics, as much of that production has shifted down from China over the course of the last few years in order to avoid the US tariffs on some of those imports from China. So we're going to see more, and keep your eye out for these additional, but plan on the tariffs remaining. Now, it's another huge issue that impacts the trade and transportation community of the entire country. And that's what's going on in the Trans-Pacific ocean carriage of goods, imports from Asia into the United States, imports from China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, that are overwhelming our capacity to handle them. Ocean carriers have every container available being utilized, every chassis available on the ground here, and I understand in China as well. Every chassis that's available is being utilized. And the ships are shipping as full as they can coming in, and every ship is being deployed. Now, going back, we recall that about this time last year, we were finding ocean carriers were taking ships out of service because with COVID, there was a decline first in the production of goods in China, and then a decline later in consumption here in the US. But both have roared back, and consumption is as great as ever, and China's production, as well as Korea and Taiwan, Japan, Vietnam, and other places, has ramped up as well. Thanks to e-commerce, thanks to the fact that we're staying home and remodeling our houses over and over again, I guess, redecorating. I would say that this is a time when we've got volumes that are unanticipated. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. Sorry for that. That was actually, it was a big importer in Los Angeles who's pulling his hair out because the ports are so congested there. But that was where I was going with this. The port in LA and Long Beach specifically are so congested because they have little terminals that are unable, with the exception of one terminal, unable to handle the massive ships that are now coming in full. The freight rates, as you know, on the import inbound from Asia is higher than it's probably ever been, with freight rates, maybe published rates at $8,000 a container. But as some people say, you actually want your container on a ship and heading to the US, well, that'll be another 4,000 or more. So those freight rates are high. There's not enough capacity to handle all that volume that is trying to get into the United States. The congestion at the ports is a result of those volumes, as well as inefficiencies that have created and exacerbated the congestion. The inability of carriers to provide dates and times when their ship will arrive, the inability of exporters and importers in the heartland of the country to have any idea of when their free days begin and end at the port, and the detention and demurrage charges that are charged by the carriers and by the terminals for failure to come in and pick up a container during the allotted free days on a timely manner, or the failure to bring your export cargo to the port and get it into the terminal at the appointed time, many times and almost always due to the fact that it's impossible because the ship isn't there yet, or the terminal isn't open, or there isn't an appointment available, all sorts of reasons why the system has been breaking down. But here's what's got the Federal Maritime Commission really exercised, as well as members of Congress, as well as the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNBC, Wall Street Journal are all covering this story. While the ocean carriers are making more revenue based upon their public statements of the presidents, global presidents of the ocean carriers, they're making more revenue now than they've ever made, very profitable. And largely they feel that it's deserved because for many years they were losing money every year. But while they're making this money, there are many importers and exporters that are on the verge of bankruptcy because these demurrage and detention charges are mounting to hundreds of millions of dollars in aggregate around the country. We have some Agriculture Transportation Coalition members that have $15 to $20 million of these charges by the ocean carriers that they are contesting, and not always easy, and never quickly are they getting those challenges resolved. So we have a situation now where the Federal Maritime Commission has now, for the first time in its history, issued an industry-wide subpoena against the ocean carriers to have them explain why they feel justified to charge these detention and demurrage fees. why are they imposing them, and what measures they can be taking to reduce the congestion and thus reduce the environment and situation that leads them to charge this demurrage and detention. There are quite a few steps that could be taken, and ocean carriers will be explaining why they're taking the steps they're taking, why they're not taking the steps that the Federal Maritime Commission issued in an order last year. They ordered the ocean carriers to comply with guidelines that the commission developed as to what would be a reasonable charge for detention demurrage and what is not reasonable for whatever reason. And I believe very poor legal advice. The ocean carriers have either neglected or refused to comply with any one of the guidelines that the Federal Maritime Commission took 2 years to develop, to provide them guidelines, not to penalize carriers, but to provide them guidelines so the carriers could know what the commission would find to be reasonable. As a result of ignoring those, the entire maritime industry is subject to the subpoena that was issued yesterday by the Federal Maritime Commission. I think we may see some changes in carrier behavior that could lead to less congestion and more fluidity, but it's unclear if and when that'll happen. So you have members of Congress from states that are particularly impacted, and particularly impacted are states where products that we grow, process for export are based, because another concern raised by the Federal Maritime Commission is evidence that ocean carriers are declining to carry export cargo from the US because they want to eliminate the delay that loading a container for exports entails, especially if that cargo, like cotton, for example, does not originate close to a seaport on the Pacific coast. So that container to pick up that cargo that origins in the Midwest or Southeast, whether it's lumber or cotton or soybeans or beef or pork and so forth, that container has to travel quite a ways to come into the heartland to get loaded and then travels back. Ocean carriers, when they get that container back to the Pacific coast, loaded, put it on a ship, they get maybe $300 to maybe $1,200 in freight revenue for that export move, after losing, in their term, losing the container all the way to the inland parts of the United States and the delay to load the container. Compare that to the $8,000 to $12,000, $13,000 they're making on that container coming into the United States with the consumer goods, footwear, apparel, consumer electronics, and so forth. So carriers have, and you can understand the business objective, declined to carry that export cargo, foregoing $300 to $1,200 revenue, in order to increase the number of voyages during which they can carry inbound cargo into the United States at the much higher ocean freight rates. This has got members of Congress very concerned, because US exporters are now unable to affordably and dependably deliver export cargo, the things we grow and process in this country, to the foreign customers. They're losing the foreign customers. And I'll tell you, members of Congress, they might like consumer goods and the e-commerce stuff that pours in, but nothing tugs at the heart of a member of Congress more than the farmer, the food processor, the rancher, grower, so forth. Those are constituents who live in their congressional districts or states, who work there, whose land is there, et cetera, and they go to bat for them. So we may see some amendments to the Ocean Shipping Act that's been around for about 22 years. They may be coming. They may be coming in a way that ocean carriers may not like. It may disrupt, these changes may disrupt the status quo, and some would say good, disrupt it, because right now it's not working. So that's what's on the horizon for ocean shipping. I would say on trucking, you know that statement, if you got it, a truck brought it. We have a typical change every time there's a change in administration from Republican and Democrat. And here's one which has been proven to be in place. When it's a Democrat in the White House, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration tends to tighten on the hours of service that can be driven by a truck driver. It's due to the influence of Teamsters and labor. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just telling you what we have observed for the last 25 years. The hours of service, restraints on the number of hours, the length of the rest periods and so forth, tighten up with a Democratic administration, loosen up with a Republican administration. And we've seen it going from Bill Clinton to George Bush, from George Bush to Barack Obama, tighter, looser, tighter. And now we're going from a Republican administration where it got looser again to a tighter environment, and I believe is coming with a Democratic administration. That is just like clockwork. That's the way it works. But I think we're going to have tighter hours of service restraints, number of hours a driver could drive. And I think that could exacerbate the shortage of drivers and trucks available on our road. Already, we are essentially at capacity for drivers and for trucks and for chassis. So look for that if you're going to look forward. So finally, trade tariffs remain the same. China tariffs, same. Ocean shipping remains for a bit in dysfunction, if you will, across the Pacific, but it is going to be addressed. It is already starting to be addressed. And once Congress gets involved, it's always hard to predict what the result's going to be, but look for change there. And then when we're looking at trucking, looking at some of the shortages and constraints tightening up. And so with that, if there's any questions, points, or verbal rotten tomatoes you want to throw, go ahead.
No rotten tomatoes here, Peter. I've got so many questions myself, and every time I wanted to ask one, I felt like you were about to answer it, and you did. So thank you for that. We did have a question from Scott Sigmund, and Scott's question is, are the same eastbound trans-Pacific market imbalance forces in the U.S. being faced in competitive markets such as Brazil for corn and soy agriculture, or Mediterranean European markets for cotton, et cetera?
Well, when Scott asks a question, we all got to listen because he's one smart economist, I'll tell you that. I think the answer to this is that a lot of these constraints are in place in other trades. They're just not as evident as they are in the Trans-Pacific to Los Angeles and Long Beach. Many of the carriers and importers are trying to shift, as a matter of fact, to other ports of entry where there's less constraint, less restriction. For example, Oakland is now getting, for the first time in history, a first port of call ocean shipping route. CMA CGM has initiated this. First port of call in the United States West Coast is Oakland. Never happened before, as people are fleeing. Now, you can ask the question, why don't people go? I might be anticipating one. Why don't people, if you've got 50 ships laying at anchor outside of LA and Long Beach, why don't people just take that and go through the Panama Canal and come to Savannah and Charleston, which is partially an answer. These problems are not as great at the Southeast ports, for example, Savannah, Charleston, Houston, and Norfolk, and even New York, which isn't going as smoothly as it could, but it's not as bad as LA, Long Beach. And the answer is, it takes 30 days round trip China-based port to LA Long Beach might take you a lot longer to actually get your ship at berth, but at least you got there in 30 days. But it's a 60-day through the Panama Canal to the Southeast. And if you're a major importer, you have e-commerce demand you want to satisfy, and that extra month of a voyage you're trying to avoid. But that demonstrates that there's less congestion and delay and disruption at other places. There's less going to Europe, there's less coming out of Brazil, but it's still impacting because you know what, the carriers are moving those ships around where they can. And, you know, they've got more demand for cargo coming eastbound into South America than they have capacity as well. It's just not as bad as LA Long Beach.
Thanks, Peter. We have another question from Donna Lim, who's the Executive Vice President of Sales at IMC Companies. And I'm sure you guys probably share a lot of mutual interest. Donna asks, can you share your thoughts on what we should do about storage charge abuses by railroads on freight moving IPI into Memphis and other major rail hubs? Still struggling with FMC not recognizing officially IPI jurisdiction.
Well, here's what I usually do when I get a question like this. I call Donna Lim, what the answer is. So, you know, what would be really great is if Donna would turn on her video and microphone and answer that question. Otherwise, you know, I'll take a guess, but Donna is the expert on this for sure. Look at the Federal Maritime Commission. You know, sometimes they're mired back in the old days, you know, and they're not used to taking firm action, and they're certainly not used to expanding their jurisdiction, even if their jurisdiction includes, under the Ocean Shipping Act, an IPI move. In other words, a movement to a port and then on from the port intermodally, you know, by rail or truck to inland points, and then the congestion and problems that you have at the ports, ocean carriers think, well, that's their business. But what's wrong with a rail ramp in Memphis? In our view, and you're right, Donna and I share a lot of the same views on this because she's taught me everything about this. But, you know, the FMC said, well, if it's at the seaport, it's their jurisdiction. But if it's a rail ramp in Memphis, it's not their jurisdiction, which is ridiculous because the ocean carrier contract for a store door movement goes from China all the way to the door, wherever it is in the United States. And part of that is that rail at the, you know, at the port, but the rail at the seaport, but also at the inland depot. So that's ridiculous. But this is a Federal Maritime Commission that's largely afraid of its own shadow. So they're unlikely to want to expand. They are also afraid of the railroads. The railroads have told them to stay out. And maybe the FMC is smart to stay out when the class one railroads tell them to stay out of business, because you've got a Surface Transportation Board, which does have jurisdiction over this, and they haven't been able to make the inroads. We just have some economic factors in our country that are more powerful than the government agencies that were established to regulate them and protect the shipping public from them. So that's a reality. That's what we've seen at the Federal Maritime Commission. Up to now, the Federal Maritime Commission typically checked with ocean carriers before they picked their nose, much less actually regulated. And I think the Surface Transportation Board has sort of the same history. Congress will step in if things get so bad. Railroads were deregulated in 1980. Ocean carriers, little deregulation, that Shipping Act 1984. There is the need to get engaged again, and I think it's going to take Congress, Donna, not the FMC, to expand the jurisdiction, the authority, and direction to the Federal Maritime Commission or some other agency, if the FMC won't step up, to actually get involved and protect the people who need those inland rail ramps to operate efficiently.
Thanks, Peter. I think you really hit the nail on the head. The FMC being somewhat of a paper tiger, and those economic interests, as you mentioned, are very powerful. So it's kind of an unfortunate reality right now. But
I'd like to say that things changed at the FMC with Commissioner Rebecca Dye, who spent a lot of time in Memphis working with the Memphis supply chain. Out of all the places in the country, she picked Memphis wisely because so many of these interests, rail, truck, ocean, all come together right there, transload and so forth. She spent a lot of time, and that led to these guidelines and detention and demurrage. She's been joined, and she's taken action which the carriers don't like, including the subpoena. That's a result of her initiative, the subpoena to the ocean carriers. The other encouraging thing is that we have two new commissioners at the Federal Maritime Commission. They are Dan Maffei and Carl Bensel. Dan Maffei was a congressman previously upstate New York, and he had soybean exporters there. They issued a letter on December 16 to the ocean carriers saying their number one concern was U.S. exports. They are well, they didn't say angered, but it was very clear. This letter has a lot of steam behind it, that they do not want ocean carriers to take actions to decline export bookings, that they're there. They see in the Shipping Act a provision, actually drafted by yours truly a long time ago, to protect and develop exports from the United States. And that's one of the purposes of the Shipping Act. So they've set, this letter was a strong shot across the bow of the ocean carriers. And so now we're seeing the FMC maybe come out from behind the curtain there and step up. They're also getting a lot of encouragement. We've had members of Congress briefed. I've had members of Congress contacting the FMC. And keep in mind, these commissioners depend on Congress to confirm their nominations if they're going to keep their jobs. So we try to use whatever leverage we can. It's still an uphill battle, but I think at the end of the day, the ocean carriers themselves will benefit by acting in compliance with FMC determination of what's a reasonable practice. Not just because they're worried about the FMC, but I think the ocean carriers are, there's an orgy of profits right now for the ocean carriers across the Pacific, according to even the carriers themselves. And I think if they don't recognize they got to be in here because the economy does turn, when the economy turns, they're going to want to be in a position where they can continue to make enough money to keep their ships operating. And they shouldn't expect that the current economy is retained.
Yeah, absolutely. At some point, you would expect the worm to turn a little bit as far as the economy goes. So we do have another question from Seth Gard, Peter, related to hours of service. And he asked, historically speaking, when the parties change in the White House, how long does it take for the constraints in driving hours to be felt or seen from an objective standpoint?
Very, very good question. And very astute, because each time the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, whose leadership is appointed by the president, right? And so you get a new president, you get new people in. So it takes a while for some of the leadership of the administration to change, but that can happen fairly quickly. What takes longer is that they go through a formal notice period. And they publish in the Federal Register suggested changes. Then there's a public comment period. Then they review it and revise the suggested, another public notice, more comment, and so forth. So it can take 2 years. And that's what I would just throw out, 2 years. It can be a little faster, maybe not, but 2 years is about it.
Okay. And then we got one more from Scott Sigmund. As you've talked in general terms about the prospect of changes from the Ocean Shipping Act of 1984, and the OSRA 1998 rules. Do you see great rates and transparency given available technologies today that can expedite publishing, likely to result in tariff and especially contract publishing? Or what
Well,
would be other priority changes possible?
look at there's quite a bit of thought as to the question: why do you have a tariff file? Why do you have to file a service contract at the Federal Maritime Commission? Look at I don't know any shipper who's actually contacted the Federal Maritime Commission to find out what the tariff is and what the freight charges are that they're going to be paying. I don't know anybody who's gone to the Federal Maritime Commission archives to check what the service contract provisions are that have been filed at the FMC. In fact, the tariff filing is mostly being used by the Federal Maritime Commission itself to go enforce tariffs. In other words, if a carrier publishes a tariff and then charges less than that, the FMC comes down on the carrier for doing so. But let me ask, who's injured by that? You know, isn't that good for US commerce if the exporter importer actually pays a little less for transportation? In trucking, you're allowed to flex. And in fact, the way the tariffs worked, you publish tariff, then you have, if it's an increase in the tariff or a new surcharge, it has to be published for 30 days before it can be implemented. But a reduction can be effective immediately. So what happens when you have this system, it becomes very cumbersome. So carriers thinking in the future, we may want to increase rates if the demand is there, they go ahead and publish an increase, knowing that they have 30 days until that date that they picked comes around, that they can reduce it at any time. They can revoke it at any time. But what does that do, especially for agriculture exporters or importers who are delivering a delivered price? You got to have a delivered price. So are you going to hope that the carriers will not actually implement that increase between now and 30 days? Or do you have to factor that price of transportation, that increase, into your delivered cost? And if you do, for so many of our agriculture exports, it's pennies that make a difference whether you get the business or whether a Brazil soybean exporter, a cotton exporter, or Australia gets the business. So, you know, it just throws a lot of uncertainty for the exporter, even though the Shipping Act put that in there to protect the exporter from sudden increases. I think it works in the opposite way. So there's one of the changes that one could see in the Ocean Shipping Act is elimination of tariff filing and publication. I would also say that the Commission Bureau of Enforcement takes great pleasure in finding a little NVOCC that makes a mistake on the tariff and then beating them up like bullies, you know, for these little ones. They never seem to really go after the ocean carriers for any deviation from the tariff, but they love going after the 4-person NVO. So I think that's an area where there's going to be some change.
Thanks, Peter. And I think you alluded to this earlier, but just to kind of restate, from Tony Barnes, she asked, what changes, if any, do you anticipate on products coming from China?
I anticipate that due to the transportation challenges, but also the continuing tariffs, and that's why I started with it. Tariffs are going to stay in place. The existing tariffs are going to stay in place. There will be more restrictions on the, you know, sort of human rights effort. So therefore, cotton products coming from China, that's already changed. Because even if your product comes from China, but it's not with cotton produced in that region that's being protected, are you going to go through the effort of proving to Customs and Border Protection that your cotton, the cotton in your product, came from another part of China where the people who run the factories in that that eastern province are not running the factories in this other part of China? It's too much trouble. You're just going to shift out of China. So I would say apparel is shifting already. I mean, that's why Myanmar. I mean, who would have been upset with Myanmar, having some restrictions about 10 years ago? But now it's going to impact consumer electronics, footwear, all these things that have been shifting out of China. China itself is not eager to continue to be so dependent on the export markets. They have a growing consumption base domestically. I would see that all the consumer electronics, footwear, apparel, and other things, toys, certainly toys, most of that's out in China already. The things that are high labor, low wage sort of jobs, that's moving and it'll continue to move quickly. Now, one thing to be aware of, China is the biggest consumer of pork in the world. They're also, when things are normal, the biggest producer of pork in the world. They are our biggest market for pork. The hogs were decimated by an African swine flu, but they're coming back. When they come back, they're going to need more soybeans, but they are going to need to import less pork. And they are working on increasing their soybean production as well, although Scott Sigmund can tell you much more detail about that. But the pork production is going to ramp up fast, and we're going to be exporting less pork to China. So things are going to be changing.
Thanks, Peter. Back in August of 2020, we were really fortunate to have Randy Guilot, who's the chairman of the American Truckers Association, like yourself, speak to the club. And he alluded to a mechanism whereby, any shipper, trucker who felt that they were unjustly charged and paid detention or demurrage charges could essentially apply for relief with the FMC. Are you aware of such a mechanism, and can you shed any light on that?
There is a process at the Federal Maritime Commission that applies not only truckers, but anybody who feels that they've been unreasonably charged. I would say that I have been less than impressed with the willingness of the Bureau of Enforcement to consider those. They take each one of these charges for each incident. Say a trucker couldn't get at the rail ramp because the ramp was closed on that particular day. The commission will study that particular instance and then turn it over to the ocean carrier. Let's say that's at a seaport. And the ocean carrier will rebut it. And you'll be a year into it, and all they're looking at is that one particular instance. You got to prove that the terminal was closed. You got to prove that if it was open, that you tried to make an appointment. You got to have documentation that you called and somebody there told you they were closed, and it just gets into a mess. So I think the American Truckers Association, realizing that this system doesn't work, and I will say doesn't work is an understatement, pursued with a major action, seeking major refunds from the ocean carriers for their manipulation of the process in a way that has damaged truckers. That's very interesting. Again, the commission didn't know what to do with it. They've never had such a big claim filed. We're quite enthusiastic about that claim. I also believe that the commission would like nothing better than for that claim to go away. And again, commission has a long history of checking with ocean carriers before they do anything. So clearly commission's bias is probably against that claim, but things are changing. As I mentioned, there are now a good 4 commissioners, in my view, who would support the ATA's claim, the American Trucking Association's claim, 4 out of the 5. So I'm very glad that ATA filed that, and we're very supportive of it.
Yeah, and I think, we have a lot of steamship lines and ports who support the Memphis World Trade Club, and, we essentially all have to cooperate together. But I think most parties, would like to see a more fair and equitable system, when it comes to especially detention and demurrage charges.
Okay. The status quo with these detention demurrage charges is not sustainable. It's not, and not sustainable is not good for ports, terminals, and ocean carriers. If you've got the largest reefer protein producer and exporter in the United States now paying, which is typical for the whole industry actually, more in detention and demurrage than they are in their basic freight rate, which they budgeted for. Where do they get that money out of their budget? Where do they get those extra millions and millions out of their budget? It's not sustainable. So one of the things that any exporter has to do, or importer, is lay off people. No sense exporting more cargo at higher freight rates, or exporting at higher freight rates less cargo, and thus have greater total expenditure for freight. So you're shipping less, it's costing you more to get it there. What does that mean? That means that the foreign customer will ultimately have to go somewhere else because it's not sustainable. Not sustainable is not good for the carriers. It's not good for the ports, not good for the terminals. I've had those discussions with the executive directors of most of the major ports in this country, or at least 6 of them, and they are understanding it as well. This is an orgy, a feast for the ocean carriers right now. It's not the injury that it's causing to their own customers is not sustainable. And there's something wrong when a service provider is making more money than they ever have while pushing the entities they're providing the service to into financial jeopardy. Let's put it that way. It's not sustainable. And so that needs to be addressed for the long-term health of the whole industry.
Right. And it's a cash intensive problem too. These companies are having to, outlay that cash in advance in most cases. And, that causes a lot of companies a lot of problems with cash flow.
We have one example that egregious but not unusual. An importer it's actually agriculture importer, imports some components that go into a final product that's produced here in the US. The ocean carrier said, look, we know there are no appointments, but we can't help you because our computer is going to spit out an invoice for detention and demurrage by the time we're done, even though we know there are no appointments, so you can't get your truck in here to get it out. But we can't help you. You'll get the invoice usually within 60 days. And then you can go through the process of protesting it, which we'll generally have completed for you in 60 days. What are we talking about here? We're talking about almost a year, 3/4 of a year before he gets invoice and it gets even addressed without any commitment that you get any resolution of it. And the carrier itself says, sorry, we can't help you. The computer spits it out. That's not sustainable. That's not sustainable. So that importer, by the way, is no longer importing those import components. And thus the producer here is desperately trying to find some domestic sourcing for the interim before they move their whole plant well south of the border.
Wow.
So who benefits from that? Does the ocean
Nobody.
carrier, does the ocean carrier benefit from that? That's less cargo coming into their regular routes. So the producer that is going to produce this stuff now is going to be south of the border, and they are not going to use any trans-Pacific carrier to get it to the US market. So who benefits?
Right. Well, Peter, this has been amazing. We've really enjoyed your talk today. We're kind of coming to the end of our time, and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'm sure that we could actually just go on for hours here. And we really want to thank you for your wisdom and expertise related to all these international trade issues and the maritime industry. And so thank you for joining us today and sharing your insight.
Thank you. If you have any further questions, send them to Donna Lim.
We'll be sure to do that. And Peter, also for your time today, the Memphis World Trade Club would like to make you an honorary member of the Memphis World Trade Club for the next year. And so you are now a member of the Memphis World Trade Club, and we want to thank you for being a friend and supporter. And hopefully we can have you back in a few years' time or so to give an update to the club. So
Thank
we
you
really
very
do.
much. You do a great
Really do
job.
appreciate it. And then finally, for everyone on, I want to thank you guys for taking the time out today. And again, if you're not a member, we encourage you to become a member of the Memphis World Trade Club. And then on March 16th, we are going to have Randy Richardson, who is the Shelby County Port Commissioner, speak to the club. And specifically, he'll be talking about developments with the Plaquemine Port Initiative and the Mississippi River and the new vessels that they are developing, which could have really significant economic impacts on the Memphis area. So please join us on March 16th, and hope everybody stays warm and safe. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Dan.